Let's get started. Story number 1.
We had been planning the winter camping trip for months. Our usual spot in the mountains was a favorite, and the snowstorm forecast didn't deter us. In fact, we thought it would add to the adventure. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Alex, his girlfriend Rachel, and 2 other close friends, Kyle and Anna. The hike into the woods was uneventful, but we knew the weather would turn at some point. The snowflakes were already beginning to fall by the time we set up camp, and the wind was picking up. We joked and laughed, setting up our tents quickly, eager to get the fire going before the storm really hit. "Storm's coming in faster than I thought," Kyle said, glancing nervously at the clouds. "Don't jinx it," Alex shot back, always the optimist. But soon enough, the storm was upon us in full force. The wind howled through the trees, the snow falling heavier, faster, until it was hard to see more than a few feet in front of us. We huddled around the fire as night fell, the warmth of the flames a small comfort against the growing cold. The snowstorm outside made everything feel isolated, distant, like the world had shrunk to the little circle of light our fire created. We were joking around, trying to ignore how the wind made the trees groan and snap in the distance when we heard it. A whisper. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I glanced around at the others, but they were still talking, unaware. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Rachel. She looked at me, wide-eyed, and nodded slowly. "What was it?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. I couldn't answer. The whisper came again, more distinct this time, like it was just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Help!" It was faint, but unmistakable. A voice. And it was close. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I looked around, my heart racing. The others were still laughing, oblivious. Rachel turned to me, her face pale. "You heard that too, right?" I nodded. "Yeah, but it's just the wind, right?" Rachel shook her head. "That wasn't the wind." We both turned toward the woods, but nothing moved. Only the howling wind and the snowflakes swirling in the air. I wanted to believe it was just the storm messing with our senses, but something in my gut told me otherwise. The feeling didn't go away. It lingered, cold and uncomfortable, like being watched. The night wore on, and we tried to ignore the unease that had settled in our camp. We piled into our tents, the wind outside growing fiercer, until it sounded like the trees themselves were screaming. I lay awake in my tent, the sound of the storm outside almost deafening. My thoughts kept drifting back to that whisper. Then, just as I thought I might finally fall asleep, I heard it again. "Help me." This time, it was clearer, louder. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It was a voice. And it was close. Too close. I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, listening. The voice came again, this time with more urgency. "Help me." I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The snowstorm outside had intensified, the winds roaring as they pushed against the walls of the tent. My breath came out in clouds as I stepped into the blizzard, my boots sinking into the thick snow. "Alex!" I shouted. "Rachel! Kyle! Anna!" There was no answer. The storm had swallowed my voice. I stumbled forward, trying to make out any shape through the snow and darkness. The whisper came again, clearer than ever. "Help me." I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. The voice was right behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight swinging wildly, but there was nothing. Only the storm swirling around me like a living thing. Panic began to set in. I was alone, isolated in the midst of the snowstorm, and that voice wasn't natural. It wasn't just someone lost in the storm. It felt wrong. I turned back toward the camp, my flashlight flickering as I stumbled through the deep snow. My breath was ragged, the cold seeping through my jacket, but I didn't stop. I had to get back to the others. When I reached the camp, I found Rachel standing outside her tent, her face pale, her eyes wide. "I heard it too," she said, her voice shaking. We both looked around, but the camp was empty. "Where's everyone else?" I asked, my voice tight with fear. Rachel pointed toward the trees. "They went out. They heard it too." I felt my stomach drop. "What? Why would they go out there?" Rachel whispered, but they did. We stood there for a long moment, staring into the swirling snow. Then, from deep in the woods, we heard it again. "Help me." It was coming from the forest, distant but unmistakable. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Rachel's arm. "We have to find them." We set off toward the woods, calling out for Alex, Kyle, and Anna, but the wind swallowed our voices. The storm was so thick now we could barely see the trees in front of us, but we followed the sounds of the whispers deeper into the forest. The voices led us deeper and deeper until we couldn't even hear the storm anymore, just that faint whispering cry. Help me. Then suddenly everything stopped. The whisper was gone. The wind had died down, and the storm seemed to pause as if holding its breath. We were surrounded by complete silence. "Do you hear that?" Rachel whispered. I strained my ears, but there was nothing. The silence was deafening. Then behind us we heard it. A snap. A branch breaking. We both turned, our hearts in our throats, but there was no one there. Then a flash of movement, too quick to be human, just beyond the tree line. "Go, now!" I screamed, grabbing Rachel's hand. We ran blindly through the trees, the snow stinging our faces, the ground uneven beneath us. The snow had become a blinding wall, and we could barely see through the whiteout conditions. My breath was coming in sharp gasps as we pushed ourselves faster. When we finally reached the camp, Alex, Kyle, and Anna were standing there, staring at us. Their faces were blank, their eyes empty. "You shouldn't have gone out there," Alex said in a voice that wasn't quite his own. What are you talking about?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Anna's lips curved into a strange, unsettling smile. "You didn't hear the call. You didn't listen." And then I understood. The storm, the whispers, they had been trying to lure us, lead us into the woods. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the tents, the storm outside raging as if it were alive. In the morning, when the snow had finally stopped, we packed up and left without another word. The hike back to the trailhead was long, but when we finally reached the parking lot, I realized something. None of us spoke about what had happened. We never spoke about it again. But to this day, every time I hear the wind howl through the trees, I can't help but remember that voice, calling to us from the storm. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snowstorm came out of nowhere. It wasn't on the forecast when we'd planned our trip, and it certainly wasn't there when we checked again before heading into the backcountry. But by the time we were halfway to our campsite in the Northern Rockies, the flakes had started falling fast, thick, and unrelenting. There were 3 of us, me, my best friend Alex, and his girlfriend Rachel. We'd all grown up hiking and camping, but this was our first winter trip together. Alex had convinced us it would be an adventure, a chance to experience the wilderness in a way most people never dared. Now, trudging through knee-deep snow with the wind howling around us, I was starting to regret it. "We should stop here," Rachel said, her voice barely audible over the storm. Her face was red from the cold, and her hair was already frosted with snow. Alex checked the GPS and shook his head. "The site's only another mile or so. If we stop now, we'll lose too much time digging out a spot." I hesitated, looking at Rachel. She was clearly miserable, and to be honest, so was I. But Alex was stubborn, and I knew he wouldn't let up unless things got really bad. So we pressed on. By the time we reached the clearing, the snow was waist deep, and the wind was cutting through our layers like knives. We worked quickly to set up the tents, our fingers stiff and clumsy with cold. The trees around us groaned under the weight of the snow, and the sky above was a swirling mass of gray. Once the tents were up, we huddled inside one of them, eating granola bars and trying to warm up. The storm outside was relentless, shaking the fabric and howling like a living thing. "This is insane," Rachel muttered, pulling her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. Alex laughed, though it sounded forced. "Come on, it's part of the experience. We'll laugh about this later." "Assuming we don't freeze to death," I said, only half joking. The hours dragged on, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Eventually, we decided to call it a night, retreating to our separate tents. Alex and Rachel shared one, while I was alone in the other. That's when it started. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint, whispering sound almost drowned out by the storm. But as I lay there trying to fall asleep, it became clearer. "Help me." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A voice. "Help me." I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound seemed to come from just outside the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the flap, shining the beam into the storm. The snow swirled thick and heavy, but there was nothing there. "Alex?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Rachel?" No response, just the howling wind. I ducked back inside, convincing myself it was just my imagination. The storm was messing with my senses, that's all. But then I heard it again. Help me. This time it was louder. Closer. I grabbed my flashlight and scrambled out of the tent, the cold hitting me like a slap. I stumbled through the snow toward Alex and Rachel's tent, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Alex! Rachel! I shouted, pounding on their tent. Alex unzipped the flap, his face groggy and annoyed. What the hell, man? Did you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking. Hear what? The voice. Someone's out here. Rachel sat up behind him, her eyes wide. What are you talking about? I swear I heard someone calling for help, I said, glancing nervously over my shoulder. Alex sighed. It's probably the wind. Go back to bed. Before I could argue, the sound came again. Help me. All three of us froze. This time there was no mistaking it. The voice was faint but distinct. A desperate plea that cut through the storm like a knife. Alex grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the tent. Rachel and I closed behind him. We stood there in the swirling snow, straining to see anything beyond the weak beams of our lights. Hello? Alex called out. The wind answered, carrying the voice with it. Help me. It was coming from the woods. We can't just ignore it, Rachel said, her voice trembling. Alex hesitated, then nodded. Stay here, he told Rachel. We'll check it out. No way, she said, grabbing his arm. I'm not staying here alone. Reluctantly, Alex relented. Together, the three of us plunged into the trees, the snow crunching beneath our boots. The voice grew louder as we went, guiding us deeper into the woods. Help me. The sound was strange, too clear, too consistent, like it wasn't affected by the storm at all. My gut told me something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Finally, we reached a small clearing. The voice stopped. We stood there, shining our flashlights around, but there was nothing, just snow and trees. This doesn't make sense, Alex muttered. Then Rachel screamed. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the trees, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible through the snow. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by shadow. Who's there? Alex demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. And then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the woods. We didn't wait to see where it went. We ran, stumbling and tripping through the snow, back to our campsite. By the time we got there, the storm had started to ease, but the fear remained, gnawing at our nerves. We didn't sleep that night. Instead, we sat huddled around a small fire, jumping at every sound and shadow. When dawn finally broke, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. On the way back to the trailhead, we passed an old wooden sign half buried in snow. The paint was faded, but the words were still legible. Warning, area closed, unexplained disappearances reported. We didn't say a word. Even now, I can't explain what we saw or heard that night, but one thing's for sure, I'll never go camping in a snowstorm again. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm was not part of the plan. Chris and Natalie had been meticulous in preparing their winter camping trip, choosing a scenic route through the mountain trails that were supposed to be clear for the weekend. The forecast had predicted light flurries, but nothing like the blizzard that had swallowed the world around them by late afternoon. I told you we shouldn't have pushed past the last trail marker, Natalie muttered, her breath visible in the frigid air as she hammered stakes into the frozen ground. The wind howled through the trees, an eerie, unrelenting sound that seemed to press in from all sides. Chris, crouched on the other side of the tent, barely heard her over the roar of the storm. We'll be fine, he shouted back. Once the tent's up, we can ride this out. It's just snow. Natalie didn't respond. She wasn't sure what unnerved her more, the storm itself or the oppressive silence that seemed to settle between each gust of wind. The forest had gone completely still, the usual sounds of wildlife swallowed by the snow and the cold. It felt as though they were the only living things for miles. By the time they got the tent erected, the temperature had dropped even further. Chris lit the small propane heater while Natalie unrolled their sleeping bags. The inside of the tent was cramped, but it was better than being out in the storm. It's just one night, Chris said, forcing a smile as he handed Natalie a thermos of hot cocoa. We'll head back in the morning once the snow lets up. Natalie nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind outside seemed almost alive, wailing like a distant cry. She wrapped her hands around the thermos and tried to focus on its warmth. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the heater cast a dim glow that barely pushed back the shadows in the tent. Chris had dozed off, his soft snores mixing with the wind. Natalie, however, couldn't sleep. Her nerves were on edge, every sound outside the tent amplified by the quiet inside. Then she heard it. A faint voice carried on the wind. "Help me." Natalie sat up, her heart pounding. She held her breath, straining to hear over the storm. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then it came again, clearer this time. "Help me. Please." Her stomach twisted. It was a woman's voice, desperate and pleading. She shook Chris awake, panic evident in her wide eyes. "What?" he grumbled, groggily rubbing his face. "Listen," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" Chris sat up, frowning. The wind howled outside, but then he froze. The voice came again, unmistakable now. "Help me." Chris's expression hardened. "It's probably the wind," he said, though his voice wavered. "No, it's not," Natalie insisted. "It sounds like someone's out there." "Who would be out here in this storm?" Chris asked, but he grabbed the flashlight anyway. Unzipping the tent, he shone the beam into the swirling snow. The light revealed nothing but white, endless and impenetrable. "Hello?" Chris called, his voice barely carrying over the wind. There was no response. He zipped the tent shut and turned back to Natalie. "There's no one out there." "But I heard it," she said, her voice trembling. "I swear I did." Chris put a hand on her shoulder. "It's just the storm messing with us. Try to get some sleep." But Natalie couldn't. She lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling as the wind continued to scream outside. Every now and then she thought she heard the voice again, faint and distant. Then came the sound of footsteps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Her blood turned to ice. The steps were deliberate, slow, and heavy, circling the tent. She shook Chris awake again, panic rising in her chest. "Listen," she whispered urgently. He sat up, frowning. The footsteps were unmistakable now, crunching through the snow just outside. Chris grabbed the flashlight again and unzipped the tent. The beam swept across the clearing, revealing fresh tracks in the snow. They were deep and perfectly round, like someone had been walking barefoot through the snow. But there was no one there. "Who's out there?" Chris shouted into the storm. The footsteps stopped. "Get back in here," Natalie hissed, pulling him back inside. Chris zipped the tent shut, his face pale. "We'll stay inside until morning," he said, gripping the flashlight tightly. The hours crawled by. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind shrieking like a living thing. Occasionally they heard the voice again, closer now. "Help me." Natalie covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Why won't it stop?" she whispered. Chris didn't answer. He was staring at the tent wall, his knuckles white as he clutched the flashlight. Then, suddenly, the tent collapsed inward, as though something had slammed into it. They both screamed, scrambling out into the freezing night. The storm had calmed slightly, but the clearing was eerily quiet. The footprints were back, circling their tent in a perfect loop, and standing at the edge of the trees was a figure. It was barely visible through the swirling snow, its outline distorted and blurry, but it was there, motionless, watching them. Chris shone the flashlight toward it, but the beam seemed to pass through the figure as though it weren't solid. "What the hell?" he whispered. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and jerky. Natalie grabbed Chris's arm. "We have to go. Now." They didn't bother packing up their gear. Grabbing only their packs, they ran blindly into the forest, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The figure didn't follow, but they could feel its presence, pressing down on them like a weight. The storm faded as they made their way back to the trailhead. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an eerie light over the snow-covered landscape. When they reached their car, they climbed inside and slammed the doors, locking them. They didn't speak as Chris started the engine and pulled onto the icy road. The tension in the air was thick, neither of them daring to look back. It wasn't until they were miles away that Natalie finally broke the silence. "What was that?" Chris shook his head. "I don't know, and I don't want to." That night, as they unpacked their gear at home, Natalie found something strange in her pack. It was a scrap of cloth, frozen and stiff, with a single word scratched into the surface: "Stay." She stared at it, her hands shaking. She hadn't packed anything like that. When she showed it to Chris, his face went pale. Neither of them spoke about it again. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm hit faster than any of us expected. The weather app had predicted light flurries for our weekend camping trip, nothing we couldn't handle. By the time we reached the mountain trailhead, though, thick clouds had swallowed the sky, and icy wind began to bite through our jackets. "I don't like this," Kelly muttered, tightening her scarf as she glanced up at the heavy sky. "It's just snow," said Chris, her boyfriend, who always tried to downplay everything. "We've got the gear. We'll be fine." There were 4 of us, me, Kelly, Chris, and my roommate, Sarah. Sarah and I had been hesitant about this trip, but Chris had insisted we needed a real winter adventure to shake off the stress of city life. The idea had sounded fun in the warmth of our apartment, but now, trudging through the growing drifts of snow, I felt a pang of regret. We hiked for hours, the snow deepening with every step. By late afternoon, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Trees loomed like ghosts in the white haze, and the trail disappeared beneath the snow. "This is bad," Sarah said, panting as she paused to catch her breath. "We need to set up camp before we get completely buried." Chris nodded reluctantly, scanning the forest for a flat spot. Finally, we found a small clearing shielded by a stand of towering pines. It wasn't ideal. The snow was deep, and the wind howled through the gaps in the trees, but it was the best we were going to get. Setting up the tents was a miserable affair. Our hands were numb despite our gloves, and the wind kept whipping at the fabric, threatening to tear it from our grasp. By the time we were done, darkness had already started to creep in. Huddled around a small camp stove, we ate a quick, silent dinner. The storm had intensified, the wind shrieking like something alive. Every so often, a distant cracking sound echoed through the woods as tree branches succumbed to the weight of the snow. "We'll wait it out," Chris said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Storm like this won't last long." Nobody responded. We were too cold, too tired, and too uneasy to argue. That night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay there, straining to listen, I realized it was something else. Something distinct. A voice. "Help me!" The words were faint, barely audible over the storm, but they were unmistakable. I sat up, my breath fogging in the icy air, and strained to hear again. "Help me." It was coming from outside the tent. I froze, my heart pounding. It wasn't Sarah. She was curled up in her sleeping bag, her back to me. The voice was distant, desperate, and wrong. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Snow swirled in the beam of my flashlight, but there was nothing there, just the trees swaying in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, a trick of the storm, but the unease stayed with me. Eventually, I lay back down, though I didn't sleep. In the morning, the storm had calmed, but the world outside was unrecognizable. The snow was nearly waist deep, and the trail we'd followed the day before was completely gone. "We're stuck," Kelly said flatly as we stared at the endless expanse of white. "Not stuck," Chris argued, though his face was pale. "We just have to be smart about this. We'll figure it out." We spent the day trying to dig out the trail, but it was no use. The snow was too deep, and every step felt like wading through quicksand. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up again, and the sky had darkened. "We should go back to camp," Sarah said, her voice shaking. Reluctantly, we agreed. As we trudged back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest felt different now, heavier, like the trees were closing in around us. That night, the voice came again, "Help me." This time, it woke all of us. "Did you hear that?" Kelly whispered, sitting up in her sleeping bag. Chris grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice wavered. "It's not the wind. That was a voice." We sat in silence, listening. The wind howled, and then, faint but clear, it came again. "Help me." It was closer now. Chris swore under his breath and grabbed his boots. "Stay here. I'm going to check it out." "Are you insane?" Kelly hissed, grabbing his arm. "We can't just ignore it," he snapped. "What if someone's hurt out there?" Reluctantly, the rest of us followed him. We stepped into the storm, the snow crunching beneath our boots, and shone our flashlights into the trees. "Hello?" Chris called out. "Is someone there?" For a moment, there was nothing but the wind, and then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, we saw movement. A figure emerged from the trees, barely visible through the swirling snow. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the shadows of the storm. "Help me," it said. Chris took a step forward, but Kelly grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Something's not right." The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching us. "Are you hurt?" Chris called out, his voice trembling. "Help me," the figure repeated, its tone flat and mechanical, like it was mimicking the words rather than truly speaking them. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Chris, we need to go," Sarah said, pulling at his sleeve. The figure took a step forward. We didn't wait to see what it would do next. We turned and ran, stumbling through the snow back to camp. By the time we reached the tents, the figure was gone, but the fear lingered, thick and suffocating. None of us slept that night. We sat huddled together in the largest tent, jumping at every sound and shadow. In the morning, we packed up and left. The storm had eased, but the trail was still buried, and it took us hours to find our way back to the trailhead. When we finally reached the parking lot, Kelly burst into tears. None of us spoke on the drive home. It wasn't until weeks later, when I was scrolling through a local hiking forum, that I found a post about the area where we'd camped. Other hikers had reported hearing voices in the storm, seeing figures in the snow. Some claimed it was the spirits of people who had died in the mountains. Others thought it was something older, something that didn't belong in our world. I don't know what we encountered out there, but I know one thing: I'll never set foot in those woods again. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
The snow began falling late in the afternoon, earlier than forecasted. Thomas and Lily had planned their winter camping trip for weeks, confident in their gear and experience. They were no strangers to the wilderness, and the idea of a snowy night under the stars had sounded romantic and adventurous. But as the wind picked up and the light began to fade, a sense of unease settled over them. "We should stop here and set up camp," Thomas said, pointing to a small clearing nestled among the pine trees. The ground was already coated with a thick blanket of snow, and the flakes were falling heavier by the minute. Lily nodded, her breath visible in the freezing air. "Yeah, this storm's moving in fast." They worked quickly, pitching their tent and securing it against the rising wind. By the time they crawled inside, the temperature had dropped significantly. Lily lit the small camp stove to heat some water, while Thomas arranged their sleeping bags and checked their gear. "Still think this was a good idea?" Lily teased, though her voice carried a nervous edge. Thomas grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "It's just snow. We've handled worse." But as the storm intensified, the mood in the tent grew tense. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the fabric and making it feel as though the world outside was alive and angry. They huddled close, sipping hot cocoa and trying to ignore the eerie atmosphere. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind was relentless, accompanied by strange, almost melodic whistling sounds that seemed to come from all directions. Lily glanced at Thomas, her brow furrowed. "Does that sound weird to you?" Thomas paused, listening. The wind's pitch shifted, rising and falling in a way that almost resembled a human voice. "It's just the wind," he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Lily pulled her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders, her eyes darting to the tent walls as the wind pressed against them. "It sounds like it's saying something." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but froze as a new sound cut through the storm, a faint, distant cry. It was almost inaudible at first, but as they sat in tense silence, it came again, clearer this time. "Help." Lily's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" Thomas nodded, his jaw tightening. He grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam into the swirling snow. The light barely penetrated the blizzard, revealing only a wall of white. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely carrying over the wind. For a moment there was no response. Then the cry came again, louder now. "Help me." Lily grabbed his arm. "Thomas, it's someone out there. We have to do something." He hesitated, glancing at the impenetrable storm outside. "It's too dangerous. We could get lost." "We can't just ignore it," Lily insisted, her voice trembling. "What if someone's hurt?" Thomas looked torn, but the desperation in the voice spurred him into action. "Stay here," he said, pulling on his jacket and boots. "I'll check it out." "No way," Lily said firmly, grabbing her own coat. "I'm not letting you go out there alone." They stepped out into the storm, the cold biting at their faces as they trudged through the snow. The wind was deafening and visibility was almost non-existent. They followed the voice as best they could, calling out into the darkness. "Where are you?" Thomas shouted, his flashlight beam darting across the trees. Help me. The voice was closer now, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the forest. Keep talking, Lily called. We're coming. But there was no response. The voice had stopped. Thomas and Lily stood in the clearing, their breaths coming in sharp gasps as they scanned the area. The snow was untouched, no footprints leading to or from the spot where they stood. The wind howled around them, carrying nothing but silence. This doesn't make sense, Thomas muttered. There's no one here. Lily shivered, her unease growing. Maybe we should go back to the tent. They turned to retrace their steps, but the storm had erased their tracks. Panic began to set in as they realized they were disoriented. Every direction looked the same, a never-ending expanse of white. Stay close, Thomas said, gripping her hand tightly. They walked in what they hoped was the right direction, but the forest seemed different now, unfamiliar and oppressive. The trees loomed closer together, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. Then they heard it again. The voice. Help me. This time it was behind them. Lily whipped around, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Who's there? The light caught something, a figure standing just beyond the trees. It was barely visible through the snow, a dark silhouette that didn't move or respond. Thomas felt his blood run cold. Hey, he shouted. Are you okay? The figure didn't answer. It stood motionless, its form distorted by the swirling snow. Then slowly it began to move, stepping toward them with jerky, unnatural movements. Run, Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. They turned and bolted, their boots crunching through the snow as the wind screamed in their ears. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing closer as they ran. The figure's presence was palpable, a suffocating weight that followed them no matter how fast they moved. When they finally stumbled back into the clearing where their tent was pitched, they collapsed to their knees, gasping for air. The storm had calmed slightly, and the oppressive weight of the figure was gone. But something was wrong. The tent was shredded, its fabric torn to ribbons and scattered across the snow. Their gear was strewn about, half buried in drifts. And surrounding the campsite were footprints, bare, human footprints that circled the area in chaotic loops. Lily's voice was barely a whisper. Those weren't there before. Thomas stepped closer, his heart pounding as he examined the tracks. They were deep, as though someone had been pacing around the tent for hours. But there were no other signs of life, no trail leading away, no explanation for how they had appeared. We're leaving, he said, his voice firm. Now. They grabbed what little they could salvage and set off down the trail, the storm finally beginning to abate. The sun was rising, casting an eerie light over the snow-covered landscape. But the forest was silent, unnaturally so, as if the storm had swallowed all sound. When they reached the trailhead, their car was still there, untouched and waiting. They climbed inside, slamming the doors and locking them. Neither spoke, as Thomas started the engine and pulled onto the icy road. It wasn't until they were miles away that Lily finally broke the silence. Do you think it was a person? Or, Thomas shook his head. I don't know. I don't want to know. They never went winter camping again. Story the end.